Visual flow is what we actually use to make more engaging photos. It is what we landscape photographers use to create a deeper emotional connection with the person who's viewing it. But there's an issue that I've come across, and I've been guilty of it as well, which is basically being unable to take a 3D world and put it into a 2D format and still have it appear three-dimensional, still have it have more depth. So in this video, I want to go over that issue specifically and how we can use visual flow to create more depth and make our photos not appear very two-dimensional and flat. So before I get started with the underlying problem, I want to first take some time to identify the issue, which is what is it about an image that actually looks unpleasant? And I think primarily it comes down to the image just happens to appear very flat. I don't get pulled into the image, and I feel like I'm able to just look at the image and navigate away from it. It becomes a rather, I guess, unpleasant or at least non-pleasant experience, and I just don't want to go back to the image because there's no reason to get more lost in it. And so that's the way I kind of identify that that image doesn't have visual flow. It just is very two-dimensional and it doesn't have any depth to it. Let's break it down into a couple of different issues that might be causing this. And it really varies from photo to photo. Not every photo needs to have this to make it great. But I think these are some elements that you need at least one of to actually make the photo appear more three-dimensional. And so the first thing that I would say is there's a lack of foreground element. Some photos really benefit from having a foreground element that can pull the viewer in. That's where we use our wide-angle cameras, sometimes even our phone cameras, to emphasize the foreground element so that it is the first thing that appears right in front of us, because people tend to look from bottom up. And so with a strong foreground element, you're more likely to get guided from that foreground element into the back of the photo. So foreground to midground to background. And just the lack of that foreground element makes that space appear very flat, and there's nothing actually then drawing us further into it. There's no depth per se. And that actually brings me to the next issue, which is not strong enough midground or background. And when you do have those midground and backgrounds, they just don't blend well together. So you can have a strong foreground, but if that strong foreground isn't tied well to that midground, or that midground isn't tied well to that background, it can create a very flat image then as well. And I see this a lot in images where we try to take photos of, let's say, a nice sunset, and we have like maybe something in the foreground. It could be just grass or some form of road, and in the midground there's probably a bunch of trees that just appear like one single entity, and then the nice sunset in the back. But that midground, which is the trees that don't have any distinct features, that just appear as one amalgam, they don't really tie the foreground and the background well enough. And so you're left with two disjoint images, basically the foreground and the sunset. And that photo doesn't end up really working well because of that. And one other issue which really causes the photo to appear flat and non-engaging is just a lack of focal interest to kind of allow the viewer to settle their eyes on something. So a lack of a strong enough focal point or subject to anchor the eye is just not present in that photo. And that can cause similar issues where the viewer's eyes just glaze over the photo without actually sticking to it and engaging with it a little bit more. So now that I've covered some of the causes underlying this issue, let's go over some of the fixes that I think you can make to your photography to create a lot more depth and visual flow in your photos. Let's start off with having gradients, especially when you're moving from ground to sky, and how those gradients look. So in this first image, you can see that even before we reach the sky, we've started to form some form of layers over here and over here. And as we get closer and closer to the sky, what's happening is the contrast of the mountains is getting a lot lighter. And so by the time we get to the sky, which is right here, the mountains themselves are very light. And so that creates this layering gradient effect that adds a lot more depth to the photo and makes it a lot more engaging. Taking a look at this photo, although it has a lot of different elements, such as a foreground and a leading line that goes here, what I want to focus on is the depth and the place where the sky meets the ground, which is around here. So what I want to focus on here is these trees right here, which are pretty dark. And so if they were against a bright sky, they would appear very dark and very sharp contrasty. But because there is a nice gradient into the background where the trees are still there, there's still some haze, but it isn't as bright as the sky itself. So there is a nice gradient from darker to a little bit less dark, and then all the way back into the sky itself. It allows you to see that gradient of trees in the photo from the midground all the way back into the sky. And the second thing, which is a little bit more generic version of gradient, is just having more layers. Distinct layers in your photo allow the viewer to see the photo as three-dimensional rather than just a 2D mess. But those layers have to be joined with something, and so when you use things like fog or shallow depth of field, natural light, or texture even, to connect those layers, it appears a lot more natural and the viewer is able to understand the depth of that photo. So in this photo, we can see that the different layers are caused by the fog itself. And so you have the different foreground plants, which are a lot more darker. And then when you go into the back, you can see just subtle hints of the same plants, but because they are covered by the fog, they are distinctly further away, and the viewer is able to tell that they are further away, making the image a lot more three-dimensional. In this photo, I've used the shallow depth of field to make these grasses in the front appear very blurry, and that actually imitates a person's view when they are very close to a certain subject that they aren't able to properly focus on it. And so that adds the first layer, and then as you can see in the back, those same grasses appear, allowing you to connect this first layer of grasses to the layer of grasses in the back. And because these grasses also cover this midground layer, we're able to connect them together without feeling like they are two disjoint parts of the same image. And as that layer progresses further, it gets a little bit lighter and lighter because of the haze, and you can go back into the main subject, which is this town located over here. And because the haziness increases the further you go, it creates more layers behind that town, creating more depth in the photo. Now, not all landscape photos need to have this foreground, midground element. You can create layers in a lot of different ways. So over here, we can clearly see that the layers are created by the proximity of the camera to the leaves. And because the leaves in the back just have a lot more shadow and a lot more darkness, you can see that closer up leaves are a little bit blurry, the ones in the midground are a little bit brighter and a little bit less blurry because the wind isn't reaching them as well. And then all the leaves in the back over here, they're covered in shadow and they're pretty dark. So there's distinctions between the foreground leaves, the midground leaves, and the background leaves that really tie all the different photos together, so you can tell that there is depth in this photo. Again, similar concept with this photo, use of a shallower depth of field, so you can see that this part of the image, which is right in the front, is a lot sharper than this part of the image. So there is a distinct layering effect between the two. And then the further you go, a little bit less sharp and also a little bit darker. So you can see that there is depth further below those leaves as well, and it creates a much more three-dimensional photo. And then moving on to this image, I've used the rocks in the front, which have a shallower depth of field. They appear a little bit more blurry, but then they become more distinct than the rocks over here. So there is a distinct layer between these rocks over here and these rocks in the midground, and then that allows you to connect it all the way back into this tree over here, which means that there are several layers before you get to the tree. And so you're able to determine that it's not just a flat image of rocks in front and then a tree, but then actually layers within the rocks, allowing you to create more depth there. And then finally, in the background has a different color than the tree. That's because of the different lighting conditions present on the background versus the tree. Not only does the tree then stand out against the blackness, but it also creates a separation between the background and this tree, meaning that there is a lot more depth between the midground and the background as well. And then with this image, something similar to the rocks that I showed before, I've used the texture in the water as a midground and a foreground element, but to make sure that I'm able to kind of distinguish between the foreground and the midground to add a little bit more depth, is I've used a shallower depth of field so that this part appears a little bit blurry and this part is a little bit sharper. And so the image then doesn't appear as flat. And so we can easily guide our viewers to the main subject, which is the Statue of Liberty in the back. And because it is a distinct silhouette, it works really well against the bright sky. And for the next compositional tool that I think really helps is to have a strong foreground element and tying that foreground element to a midground and a background. Now, I've already covered that a little bit in the layers, but I'll talk a little bit more about that in these photos, and you can tell how they are distinct foreground, midground, background, and how they all connect together. For this photo, the roots of the tree act as a pretty strong foreground element, and because the roots are kind of angled inward to the photo, they act as leading lines, guiding the viewer further into the photo. And so the strong foreground element really pulls the viewer from the bottom, where you can see the roots, to a much more interesting subject, which is the waterfall, by guiding the viewer into the photo. In this photo, the foreground element is these grasses, the midground element are these trees, and the subject is this big tree over here, and in the background we have this mountain and the sky over here. Because this grass is a little bit out of focus, it does draw the viewer's attention. And then we continue with the texture of the grasses over here all the way into the back, where we have these trees. And now, because there isn't a sharp contrast separation between the trees and the grass, they are able to connect well enough together. And then from those trees at the midground to the background mountain, the color is pretty similar, and so we're able to connect those two subjects together, and the light adds a lot more interest to that part of the photo. Because the mountain has a distinct shape rather than just appearing as chaotic, we're able to have a strong connection with the sky, because the sky then acts as in support of the mountain itself, similar to how the subject over here is being supported by the dark mountain in the back. Obviously, not all photos need to have a strong foreground, midground, and background, but what is important is to create that layering effect to have a lot more three-dimensionality to the photo. But without a strong subject, you might not be able to tie the viewer's attention that much. For the viewer to actually navigate throughout the photo, they should have something that they can keep coming back to. So let's take a look at some of the photos that I think have a strong focal subject where the viewer can always anchor their view to. Obviously, in this photo, the main subject are these trees over here. There is a little bit of foreground, if you can call it that, which is the reflection caused by this, but I wouldn't really classify it as a foreground. I would say it kind of balances the space up above here, and so there are similar levels of brightness both in the reflection over here and the sky where the fog and the sunlight is mixing. But the main subject which captures the viewer's attention is the strong focal subject of these bright colored leaves. And because there is fog, we can tell that there are distinct layers between the trees over here and the trees over here and anything in between, because the fog kind of really creates that depth that we're looking for. But then because of that strong focal subject, the viewer is able to start at these trees over here, navigate around them to these trees over here, to the trees over here, going into the back, looking at the reflection over here, but always coming back to the anchor point, which is this strong subject. In this photo, there is somewhat of a foreground, which is this kind of railing over here and these rocks that point inward. There is somewhat of a midground, which is this entire river, but the main focal point of this image is the connection of the sky with the mountain over here. So even though your view might traverse at different points over here or over here or over here, because of the strong subject, it will always be guided to this one point. And I've used different compositional tools like leading lines from these rocks and this kind of arabesque river shape to always guide the viewer back to the main focal subject. Just remember that at the end of the day, these are just compositional tools that you can use. You don't have to use all of them. You don't even have to use any of them. You might actually enjoy making photos which do appear very two-dimensional, even though you're taking a three-dimensional photo. I've used this a lot of times with architecture or abstract photography, and it can be really fun. But if you do want to take a three-dimensional photo of a 3D scene, then using some of these compositional tools can be really helpful to make sure you have enough depth to guide the viewer into the photo. And if you have other ways in which you'd like to create depth and visual flow in your photos, please leave a comment down below. And if you enjoyed this video, leave a thumbs up and remember to subscribe to this channel, and I'll see you next time. Bye.